Hi, friends. Welcome to our second Q&A session. This one deals mostly with the second Advent episode, the one dealing with Abraham and Isaac, that story. And a couple people asked a lot of the same questions. The first one being, why would God promise Abraham a son and then tell him to go sacrifice him? What would have happened if he had taken Isaac up there and actually killed him? And would God have forgiven him, since it sounded like it was a common practice? I don't know how common of a practice it was. I would say that it did happen. It was something that people would do. As far as this story is concerned, one thing to always remember with the Bible is that the kind of resources that it took to write the Bible were at a premium then. Think of how expensive a computer is these days. Paper was expensive. Ink was expensive. They had to be short with words. So we don't always get to hear everything that everybody's thinking. What's interesting is that God recorded what he recorded. It's all there. He shows that God, intervened to keep Abraham and Isaac from harm. And that is the point of the story. Getting a little bit more into the idea of why God promised Abraham a son and then told him to sacrifice him. Abraham was probably asking God the same question. I imagine there are some cultural issues that God is trying to hammer out at this point. And we don't know the full ins and outs of the belief system that Abraham came out of. And we don't know the ins and outs of the belief systems that he encountered on his journey. But one thing is certain, at this moment, God is laying the foundation of his rescue mission for the human race. And we'll get a little deeper into this with some of the questions that are following. But be certain of this, God is taking drastic action because drastic actions are needed to be taken. He needs both Abraham and Isaac to understand something that can't be understood without going through this weird and difficult trial. All right, another question. Was Isaac told that he was going to die as Abraham was taking him up on the mountain? And did he even know the real reason he would be killed by his dad? It does not sound like he was told. And perhaps Abraham was more confident that the Lord would provide than this story lets on. We don't get to know at what point Isaac figures out that he's about to be killed. Though for us to even have the story means that it had to have been explained at some point, at least after the fact. They had to talk about it a lot. And I imagine that was kind of one of the points in the trial that God was putting them through. He wanted them to be thinking about him. He wanted them to know that he would come to their rescue. He would save them from bad things that they might do, and he would save them from bad things that might happen to them. Okay, next question. One person asked, how did you personally digest all this stuff, Todd? I know your life was way different than mine or some of the others in our group, but there's some real struggle here thinking about God telling anyone to sacrifice their own kid. What's a blessing in that? And that is a really good question for a lot of you. I came to Christ at a really young age, and while my trajectory was pretty wonky at some points, I cannot remember a time in my life where I haven't had a solid understanding of God's goodness. I've also never seen a blood sacrifice of any kind, because a Christian church would never call for one. And my perspective of this story is one of curiosity. I don't get to know the full reason why God would ask Abraham to do this, but it doesn't trigger anything in me like it does with a lot of you who grew up outside of the church or who have been heavily involved in a faith system that has asked people to do terrible things. God doesn't ask us to do terrible things. The Lord's teachings can be found in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, and that's probably something that we should be looking at in one of our studies coming down the road. Okay, One person asked, I wonder why God didn't tell Abraham to sacrifice that Ishmael kid instead of Isaac. A lot of the stuff in the Old Testament helps us to know God better. And then some of it helps us to know why some things are so bad today. That whole Ishmael versus Isaac story is a feud that is still going on today between Israel and her neighbors. But there's some really difficult stories in the Old Testament, like this one, that help to show us why Jesus came. And it kind of puts a frame around the world that he saved us out of. The bottom line with this story is people back in Abraham's day practiced child sacrifice. And this is the point where God broke in and said, you need to stop this. I'm not pleased with this. This doesn't honor me. As for why he didn't have Abraham sacrifice Ishmael instead, in some ways that would be even worse. Right? God doesn't want anyone to think he ever thinks about making life harder for the poor or the outcast or for those who for some reason don't fit in. And here we have Ishmael, who is struggling. He and his mom Hagar are really at odds with Abraham's wife Sarah, especially once Isaac comes along. They are at odds, and God wants. I think that God wants all of us to understand that He is a champion of the poor. He is a champion of the downtrodden. He is a champion of those who have no friends, who feel they have no hope. Next question. This one, I answered a good question about Abraham and Isaac in the last Q&A section. So you can backtrack if you haven't seen that video yet. I was asked about the kinds of things that God wants us as Christians to sacrifice. And I told a story about how my wife and I got the impression that God wanted me to quit my job and pursue ministry full time. So this question stems from that. It says, when God wanted you to quit doing that job, what blessing did he give you for being obedient? Are they more spiritual type blessings or actual things to improve our lives? And I got a kick out of this question. It's a great question. I totally get what you're getting at. There are times where I would word it exactly like that, but I do think what made me chuckle is I do think that the purely spiritual type blessings do improve our lives way more than we would ever realize. But for those of you who are involved in the email ministry, who email with me on a regular basis, if you want to know the blessing that he gave me for being obedient, go look in the mirror. You all have been such a blessing to me. God is teaching all of us so much, and he is knitting us together as the family of God. What better blessing can he give than that? I feel that's both a spiritual and a physical blessing. And I know some of you, yesterday was Thanksgiving, and some of you banded together, those of you who had no family to speak of, or at least no family that wanted to hang with you on Thanksgiving, and a bunch of you got together and had Thanksgiving tacos that sounded pretty darn good. That's a family. God is knitting a family together, and it's an amazing thing. The next question: how would anyone know what their blessing would be, or does he tell you? What did Abraham get as his blessing? Does the Bible say? God generally points us in a direction and says the blessing is over there. And we get to choose whether we want to go there and find out what the blessing is. It's part of the process that grows us as Christians. It grows us as his followers. So we can choose whether or not we want to go there and find out what it is. And with Abraham, he gave him a little more information. He told him that he would make his name great, that the whole earth would be blessed through him. And Abraham never got to see that fully materialize, at least not in this life. But he got to see it grow. He got to see it start. He got to see that God never failed to come through for him. And through the centuries, God has continually proved that he is following through on that promise. Okay, here's the last question, and the question itself kind of comes together pretty long, and my answer is long. And what I love about this question, with the first question we asked, what did Abraham think when God asked him to sacrifice his son? This question is, does it talk about in the Bible what God felt like when he had to tell Abraham to go to the mountain and sacrifice his son? I'm sure there's a reason, but as I was remembering a verse in the New Testament, God demonstrated his love for us by dying. So Abraham was blessed with Isaac late in life, and he loved him probably more than anything considering his age. Why would God even consider asking that offering from Abraham, knowing how much he loves us and how hard it was to die for me? I don't think that the Bible does mention anywhere God's thought process in this regard. But when we consider the information that we do have, we can get an idea of the kind of things God might have been thinking. Now, I do not know more than anybody else about how God processes emotions. He tells us in his word that his ways are not our ways and that he is not like us. We see some of the things around us and often have a decent idea of what's headed our way, but God has all of the information about everything, including everything that has happened and everything that will happen. Also, everything that needs to happen for his plan to come to fruition. He has all that information right now, and he had all that information when he asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac on that mountain. Now, without going too deep into this idea, because we could talk a really long time about this, everything on earth that happens doesn't have to happen for God's plan to keep moving forward. A lot of people something bad will happen and people will say, well, I guess God just must have willed it. God willed this to happen, or it's all part of God's plan. I don't think like that, because I know that choice plays heavily into our lives. We get to choose things. Right? So everything on earth that happens doesn't have to happen for God's plan to keep moving forward. If I accidentally step on a potato bug, the likelihood that God willed that to happen is actually quite small. I could have stepped over it. I could have been more careful. God could have stopped me, redirected me, any number of things. But he didn't. He doesn't want me to be some robot that is forced to do his will. He has a lot of grace for my mistakes and sins, none of which ever needed to happen. And he gives us free will and a lot of latitude to do whatever we feel like doing. His power is so absolute that he knows that at any moment he can intervene and correct the course. But he wants us to understand. He wants us to get it. And so he's willing to allow us run around and be a little wonky for a while until the real message and the real purpose sinks in. That being said, there are also times when something has to happen. He steps in and he'll tell those people who are listening to him that this is your new number one priority. Or he speaks into us that he needs us to do something for him right now. Like, I really need you to do this. And he typically does this with somebody who's already deeply committed to following him and who has a track record of obeying his voice. And for those of you who are listening in on this, who are part of the Oregon crew, an example of this would be when your fearless leader contacted me for the first time 15 years ago. God spoke deeply into me and my wife that this was my number one priority, that I was to speak with her for however long it took. And he cleared my calendar in shocking ways to the point where basically for 6 weeks, I did nothing but write to her or read what she wrote back. 15 years later, we're beginning to get a bit of an idea why he was speaking that, why he was saying this is really important. And if you guys want to know why it's so important, go look in a mirror. you're the reason it's so important. He knew that he was going to use her to reach so many of you. Of course, an even better example of something that had to happen would be when Jesus knows that he has to go to the cross. He knows it, and he doesn't want to. And who could blame him? Because he's fully God, but he's also fully human. So he's going to have to fully feel every bit of that. And he doesn't want to because he's fully human. But because he is also fully divine and has a full understanding of the redemption plan that's happening, he says, not my will, but yours, Father. And then he goes and does the one thing for us that we could never do. He pays a price that we cannot pay for sins that we can never take back. I think when we going back to the Abraham and Isaac story, I think what we see in the story is simply something that had to happen. Abraham and Isaac had to be radically changed to understand what God wants from us. Now, we know from the rest of the Bible that God hates child sacrifice. He hates it so much that he had Israel wipe whole cultures off of the earth that practiced it. Then he established the kingdom of Israel right in the heart of the territory that had been practicing that vile form of worship, and he established the foundations of salvation in the very center of it. That's what God thinks of child sacrifice. He is not for it at all. And I think that that shows us what God really thought of this task when he gave it to Abraham. I think he abhorred his own request. And the fact that Abraham obeyed it shows why it was necessary. One of the few people on earth who was actually listening to God thought that God would ask such a thing or accept such an offering. A lot of the questions have dealt with people wondering what this says about God. But what's more concerning to me is what this says about Abraham and the people around him. Abraham needed to come to a place where he understood that this kind of sacrifice was unacceptable. God saves us from our worst ideas about him. If you want to know what God is really like, look at Jesus. Look at what we have written about Jesus. He is the perfect reflection of the Father. He hated hypocrisy and injustice, but was compassionate for the masses. He was compassionate for the people who were broken. The worst of sinners found redemption in him. He never turned away people who were willing to talk, and he issued warnings to those who thought they had it all figured out. God is full of mercy, grace, and forgiveness. He doesn't need anything from any of us. It is we who need to give to him because we need what he gives back. He establishes this kind of trade with us not because he refuses to give to those who can't give back, but because we tend to consider the things that we get for free as cheap and disposable. We need to give to him so that we can have an idea of how valuable the things are that he gives back. That's it. Thank you all for listening. We have another Advent episode coming out very soon, probably tomorrow. Take care.